flight officer. In June of 1970, Captain Faherty completed the F-14 Phantom fleet replacement training and made the last stage in Miramar, San Diego. In February 72, he joined the 114th Art Box, and that is an aardvark helmet that he wore on the table here. And then he was aboard the Kitty Hawk, and he flew 150 missions over South and North Vietnam. Captain Faherty graduated from the Navy's Flight Weapons School Top Gun in 1973, and then was part of the 124th Fighter Group, and as a combat tactics instructor, electronic warfare officer. You know, this is why I have to read this stuff.
You got a free parking spot.
And he was designated Iranian Air Crew Fighter Instructor, which I really like Dennis to talk a little bit about. He then flew the F-4 Phantoms, and he was part of the 302nd, I was going to say bomber group, but it's a fighter group.
Fighter squadron.
Dennis has over 2,000 hours of flight in a fighter plane, and he has over 500 carrier landings. He's also working at the Air and Space Museum. He's involved with the Education Center at the Vietnam Memorial. And without further ado, Dennis Faherty.
Thank you. Andy, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by thanking you all very, very much for inviting me to speak here this evening at this spectacular monument to the greatest generation. Their generation won World War II and created what the country is here today. But I also want to pay special thank you to Andy and Carolyn Stegmeyer for their unbelievable hospitality and their support for this organization. I think this is the first evolution they've helped put together to bring a speaker from out of the area. And I also have a 28 handicap in golf, which I'm not very proud of. But before I get into the discussion a little bit, I like the phrase that Winston Churchill always used to say about speaking at a dinner. He said he compared it to ladies' skirts. He said it's got to be long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to keep you interested. So we're going to try to balance all that, because we're going to talk about the most exciting year of my life with my clothes on. And we're not going to get into every single detail, but it was 1972, which I was 25 years old. I was a brand new lieutenant junior grade, and I flew this airplane over here. Let's talk a little bit about the F-4 Phantom. This is a twin-engine supersonic jet fighter manufactured by McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, Missouri. It carries Sidewinders, air-to-air missiles that are infrared seekers, and it carries Sparrow missiles, which are radar-guided missiles. And to our chagrin, as naval aviators, it could also drop about 3,000 pounds of bombs. Because the average Navy fighter guy wants to be a fighter guy. He wants to go shoot down other airplanes, like the airplane you have in front of the museum here, that MiG-17, but it doesn't want to drop bombs. That's dangerous stuff. So we don't want to do that. And you got to go slow, you got to go low. So we don't like it. In Vietnam, we lost 445 F-4 Phantoms. There were 5,000 of the aircraft manufactured, and of that number, 375 were lost in combat. The rest were lost to mishaps, whether it was the Navy around their ships or the Air Force for different mishaps that they have. And we're going to try to keep it non-parochial and talk about the Air Force and the Navy kind of on equal terms. But we always used to say anybody can land on a 3-mile long runway. But that's neither here nor there. Well, I guess we'll get started in the beginning of January 1972. We're in training in San Diego aboard the USS Kitty Hawk, getting ready to go on cruise, which was scheduled to go March 1st. And we've been going out to sea for about 10 days at a time, doing exercises. And we show up on a Monday morning, and the captain comes up on the 1MC, which is the intercom system, and says, "Gentlemen," because there was only men in the Navy at that time on combat ships, about 5,000, "I have good news and bad news. Good news is we're not going out for the next 10 days. The bad news is we're going to Vietnam in 7 days." Now, a 4,500-man aircraft carrier going to the Western Pacific in 7 days, really 2 months early, is pretty catastrophic for family life. Because what happens is you have to get cars put someplace, wives put someplace, families relocated, apartments vacated. So it was a pretty catastrophic event for a lot of the men aboard the ship. But we pulled it off. And we weren't sure why. They would just tell us that, well, political situations have changed. So I guess we bought into it. Now, when we leave San Diego, we've got to go over there very quickly. Normally, we stop in Hawaii, and they did not stop in Hawaii. They kept going at 30 knots due west to get to the Western Pacific as soon as possible. And sad to say, an aircraft carrier that goes at full 30 knots tends to move very oddly. And it created a situation aboard the ship where a large percentage of the crew was seasick. And not only did the initial seasickness create problems with the portion of the crew, the aroma in the carrier for the next 2 weeks was rather biblically proportioned, I might say. Well, we get to the Western Pacific and we start flying combat missions. Pretty routine missions in Laos, Cambodia, South Vietnam, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, pretty much what everyone had told us we were going to do. And then after about 3 weeks, we get our first Liberty call to go back to the Philippines, which is where all of our crews go to relax and where the airplanes get worked on, the ships get worked on, all that kind of stuff. So we head back there. It's our first import period after being away from San Diego now for about 6 weeks. We get to the Philippines, and everybody goes to the winds on Liberty, all over basically the Orient. Well, the North Vietnamese decided to do something a little different. They decided to invade South Vietnam. 40,000 troops came over the border with 400 armored vehicles in the northern part of South Vietnam, Quang Tri province. And we'd been in port in the Philippines now for a day and a half. And we now knew why we left San Diego early. Now, how many people have seen the movie Mr. Roberts? Do you remember the scene on the pier after they get their first liberty? You know, he's always fighting with James Cagney about getting the crew and how everybody went absolutely crazy. They get thrown out of port. They're all standing there. Well, now they had to get a 4,500-man crew back on the carrier in 18 hours from all over the Western Pacific. And it was kind of like that scene from the movie. And we were in absolutely no condition, to say the least, to start briefing and understanding targeting and things of that nature when we got back to the ship. And we had to send helicopters all over the Philippines to try to find these aviators. You have to understand, and I know it's talked about throughout all our war histories, only about 10% of people in a unit at most really actually see combat. Well, on aircraft carriers, it's even more than that. You've got about 4,500 people, and barely 250 actually see combat. Those are the aviators. So those are the guys we got to get. We started flying combat missions as soon as we got back off the coast of Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin. We knew politically that the United States, the Nixon administration was in office. No way in hell is anyone going to send more troops to Vietnam on the ground. Right now, at that point in time, in 1972, we had about 35,000 troops on the ground in all of Vietnam. They were instructors, they were teachers, they were helpers. They really were not combat troops. So they realized that the only weapon we had was aviation. So they started taking the number of attack sorties from 135 to 600 a day. But the most significant ones were the B-52s. The B-52s are flying, prior to March 1st, 72, they're flying 33 missions a day out of Guam. They escalated that up to 155 missions a day. Now, a B-52, they fly in groups of 3. They carry 100 500-pound bombs, 3 aircraft. And we have no troops on the ground. This is pretty much a South Vietnamese evolution with some American advisors. The B-52s, the Air Force B-52s, did a pretty spectacular job. But the amount of ordnance dropped was astronomical. But it actually helped the South Vietnamese turn back the initial assault from the north, which was a full-scale military operation. It was not the Viet Cong, which were guerrillas. It was the real thing. The Navy, around the second week in March, says we're going to do an Alpha Strike. Alpha Strike is a large strike at the heartland of North Vietnam, Haiphong in particular, because the Navy was responsible for Haiphong and the Air Force was responsible for Hanoi. So we get the word that we're going to Haiphong. Now, American airplanes had not been up there for about 18 months because of the political bombing lines they dealt with, and it gave North Vietnam, especially the major cities, an opportunity to rearm immensely. So we get the word that we've got to do a lot of planning, that we're going to go up and protect the attack aircraft because we're fighters. But they are going to give us a few weapons on our wings to carry, which take a lot of gas, by the way. You know, the cliche is a Navy fighter only has too much gas when it's on fire. So we start planning for this evolution. And we said, well, the best way to plan for this is probably to have a little holy water, a few cocktails in the bunk room. And so the night before the mission, we had a little get-together, and our intelligence officer told us about how in World War II, the kamikaze pilots, you know, would wear these white cloth headbands with a rising sun logo and Japanese characters on it. We thought that was a great idea. Why not? We figured we were all going to die or we were going to be POWs. And that was probably because of the holy water we had been imbibing at the time. So we make up these headbands, and they look pretty cool. So we wanted to put some characters, Japanese characters on it. Anybody know Japanese? No. Okay. Wait a minute. I've got a Sony Trinitron TV in my room. Let me go see what's on the back of the TV. What is it say? And part of it's in Japanese. So we duplicated the letters on the back of a Sony Trinitron, and then that morning we wore the headbands when we struck Haiphong. We, very fortunately, we did not lose any aircraft that mission. When we came back, and you got the debriefs from the intelligence community, they were telling us that they expected 50% losses on that mission, but they just forgot to tell us that. But that's the nature. Those of you that have associated with the intelligence community during offensive operations know what I'm talking about. Sadly, our luck ran out April 14th. We had a crew that were bombing in the DMZ, a little bit north of DMZ, and they were hit with several rounds of AAA, and they impacted the ground at about 500 miles an hour. We got the remains back in 1988. They're identified, and they're now, resting in the various national cemeteries. Other issue was that we were one of the supercarriers, if you will, that had the capability of using the Phantom, the A-7, and the A-6 in a joint strike effort. And so therefore, they decided that we were going to continue the Alpha Strike routine for the next 56 days. And the Air Wing at that point, we go on these strikes, there's about 25 aircraft of different varieties, A-6s, A-7s, which are attack. That means drop bombs, and then the fighters to protect them. Then they found another mission for the fighters to do. Had to do with carrying bombs, or really carrying something called Rockeye. Rockeye is a canister weapon that opens up after it leaves the aircraft and distributes bomblets all over the place, but not in an anti-personnel mode, but to knock out the SAM site, the surface-to-air missile sites, which we've got some pictures of here, and knock out the AAA, so the guys behind us, the attack guys, would have it easy. So what are we doing? We're rolling in on these targets, really pissing them off. And we go, where is everybody? Because we could accelerate out. We were typically faster. We'd go in at about 600 miles an hour and stay as fast as we possibly could because we want to be maneuverable, praying we would see a MiG aircraft, which, unfortunate for myself, I never did. But a few people in my squadron did, and they were very successful in shooting them down. Then, after 6 years of political wrangling, and I believe this was in May, the American government decided that they would agree to mine the harbors, all the major harbors in North Vietnam, realizing that North Vietnam was receiving all of their war materials from Soviet bloc countries and China, primarily Soviet bloc countries. So the Navy was given the mission to mine Haiphong Harbor, the major harbor. Well, the aircraft that dropped these behemoth mines, 1,200 pounds of mine, can only drop that weapon at 300 knots. Has to be straight and level and low. Fighter guys don't want to be there. We don't want to be slow. We don't want to be low. But they made us do it anyway. And we got the mines on target, and the air wing, we did 3 missions that day. All the mines got laid in Haiphong Harbor, and ultimately there was never a ship that transited Haiphong Harbor for the rest of the war. And what we had trapped inside the harbor were 16 Soviet bloc ships, mostly Czechoslovakian and East German. So it was successful, but it basically scared the hell out of everybody I flew with. Sadly, in August 14th, we lost our second crew. It was my commanding officer, John Pitson. He had just taken over the squadron 3 days before. He'd been in the squadron. The way it works in the Navy, you're the executive officer for about a year and a half, then you take over commanding officer. So we're all very familiar with him, and he goes out one night to fly a mission, hopefully to attract MiGs to shoot down, and just never comes back. We had as much intelligence as we possibly could handle, and the best estimate was they were hit by a SAM missile. We never knew where. To this day, we don't know where. We do know we got the remains back in 1992 of those 2 folks. Between the 2 of them, they had 7 children. Okay, our crews kept getting extended. Again, we were one of the good carriers. Everything worked fine. And so we kept getting extended because certain carriers, they wanted to have 4 carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin at all times. 2 bombing in the south, the Ho Chi Minh Trail again, and supporting troops during this massive invasion, and 2 up north to strike the significant North Vietnamese targets. Well, the toll and the effort that the kids put out on the ship is really phenomenal, and it is stressful. And these are young 18, 19-year-old kids. So we had one of our import periods in the Philippines, typical of a lot of liberty going on with everybody kind of blowing off steam, and we go back to the Gulf of Tonkin to commence the missions again, as we had done before. Well, all of a sudden, on the second night out, which we were not in the Gulf of Tonkin yet, a race riot breaks out on the mess decks. And there were probably 150 young men involved in fisticuffs, that kind of thing. And this was when we always had embedded media on the large ships, on the carriers. So we had a cadre of typically newspaper people, that when they heard about this going on, you know, as it was happening, they just, I've got to contact my paper about this. So what happened is, it got an unbelievable amount of press, and an unbelievable amount of negative press. One of the press releases, the newspaper will go unnamed, New York Times, and it said that there was an attempt to take over an American Navy ship and do something else with this Navy ship. That was never the case. It boiled down to two 18-year-old sailors fighting over a prostitute. That's what started the fight, and that's how it escalated. And to this day, we wish some of those articles weren't written about taking over a Navy ship at sea in combat. So we turned around, had to go back to the Philippines. So that meant some other aircraft carrier had to stay more time on the line and not go on their scheduled liberty. So it wasn't a lot of fun. As far as I was concerned, and it was the end of the cruise, we left the Gulf of Tonkin November 5th and got back to the United States first week in December. So it was a pretty long cruise, but it was certainly exciting. And what I'm going to show you here in a minute is we have a video that was made by one of my sister squadrons, the A6s. Basically handheld 8mm stuff that's put on a VC tape. We'll watch it for a few minutes, but it's got some very, very realistic combat scenes about what a lot of people went through, especially on the strikes over North Vietnam. So let's put that on for a while now. And the squadron, these are called the VA-52 Night Riders, and they were very creative in putting this tape together.
What carrier is that?
That's the Kitty Hawk,
Kitty Hawk.
CV-63. Most naval aviators are not this sentimental with this kind of music, but that's what these guys came up with. It's game time. This is on the flight deck of any aircraft carrier on the other side of the island. We store 500-pound bombs, missiles, everything, unarmed, being ready to get armed to be put on the aircraft. Those are fuses that they put in each bomb prior to loading on an aircraft. You have to understand the Gulf of Tonkin during the summertime is generally about 100 degrees. Humidity is real close to 90%, and it is extremely uncomfortable. There's no breeze whatsoever. That's the A6 Intruder. That was the pretty much the most accurate bomber we had. When fighters, like my squadron, the VF-114 Aardvarks, would drop bombs, we were extremely fortunate if they hit the ground. Going to let you listen to some of the radio stuff that goes on during launches. This is a sequential video. You're going to see, how about those sideburns? 1972.
The only ones with the sideburns?
No. Our chief of naval operations was a gentleman named Elmo Zumwalt, who was very liberal. Some of these are actually the third and fourth strikes that we did that first week, and they had, the captain and the admiral did not think it was a great idea that we wear our headbands anymore. So the captain and the admiral dislike, we say, aye, aye, sir. 43 years ago. When that guy touches the ground, you've got 2 seconds before you get launched. That's the kid who presses the button, 18 years old. That airplane in the background there, very few museums have. It's an RA-5C, it's a Vigilante. It was originally designed as a nuclear weapons delivery platform, but was an absolute superb reconnaissance aircraft. And the fighters had to escort it over North Vietnam when it went to take pictures after the strike group had bombed them and really pissed them off. It was the only airplane in the Air Wing that could outspeed the F-14, the F-4. It was the same engines, but a much sleeker aircraft. It was faster. That's a Phantom. These kids will launch in an average combat day in Vietnam about 150 to 200 aircraft a day and recover the same amount, typically an hour and 45 minutes later. That's the RA-5. Now what we have to do is we have to find our wingmen airborne. We have to find the tanker, because fighters have to get gas after they get a catapult shot, so they have enough fuel to go over the beach. This is North Vietnam, outside Haiphong. Saying he's been just hit by a surface-to-air missile. They're in a bombing run. And he's dodging AAA. AAA was more deadly than surface-to-air missiles. AAA is the exact same thing our B-17 saw in World War II throughout Germany and Japan. We had a ship in the Gulf of Tonkin that was electronically capable of telling us a general area where surface-to-air missiles were being fired from electronically. And we just had to get our eyes on it. Once we could see a SAM missile, we could beat it. It had a long tail for initial launch of smoke. If we picked it up, and this is a typical airborne refueling evolution, which is very important to get back to the ship. And as soon as you would see the surface-to-air missile, and they had basically one variety, it's the SA-2 guideline. You would put the missile, as it came off the ground, at your 10 o'clock or your 2 o'clock, and as soon as you could see a speck on the top of the smoke trail, you pulled as hard as you can into the missile, which is a little uncomfortable. Hopefully you've got enough altitude to beat it. And the missile could not track you through that type of maneuver. But what it did do is it drove us down in airspeed and altitude down into the AAA and small arms envelope, which can be very dangerous.
Generally, how many miles were you off the coast?
The Kitty Hawk was typically about 90 miles off North Vietnam with lots of surface protection between China, which is Hainan Island, and North Vietnam. And we had to be careful about kind of wandering into China, which a lot of us did occasionally by mistake, but not with any hostile intent involved, mostly because we got lost. That's the A-3. That is an electronic warfare aircraft and a tanker. It really is a great airplane. That looks like a typical Alpha Strike that would be going feet dry.
How fast were those intruders going?
They were going about 400 knots. And that's almost the total top end of what they could do. But they were good. They were really good. They used to go out at night, one airplane at a time, by itself, terrain, navigation, basically nape of the earth flying at night over North Vietnam, drop 5 or 6 bombs on one target and leave. And these guys would come back, remarkable flying. Yes, everything is self-contained on your ship, unless there's a big multi-carrier strike, and they just put up a wall of tankers for anybody who wants gas to go and get it.
What kind of planes were they?
The A-3, they're all Navy. A-3s, we would convert some of our A-6s to tankers, but that was it. But there'd be normally plenty of gas airborne. Towards the end, we started getting some Air Force assets. That's our squadron with the orange stripe, and they go, "What the hell are you doing going into combat with orange helmets and orange stripes on your airplanes?" Well, we want the bad guys to see us in their airplanes, so maybe they come and they play with us. They never did. too smart for that. He's shooting, there's a surface-to-air missile, an SA-2. I'm sorry, that's an airplane that was just hit by an SA-2. There's one that missed. What they would do is command detonate at different altitudes. They were fully guided. However, if you beat it, they would go off at a predetermined altitude that they set on the ground. And you have to realize almost all of the technicians running the SA-2 sites were Russians, not Vietnamese. That was a SAM missile just went under that aircraft. And that's the mouth of Haiphong Harbor. We did not have the precision-guided weapons that you have today. It was iron bombs, the exact same ordnance from World War II. Exactly. Unguided, dumb bombs, iron bombs, that if you dropped enough of them and you were an accurate dive bomber, you got successful target destruction. You can see the rail yards and an airfield there that we attacked. North Vietnam came back to the bargaining table about a month and a half after this all started and started negotiating a little more seriously. One of the main reasons, and this is my support for the Air Force, is the B-52s. What they did with their arc light missions that I just described earlier, 3 aircraft dropping 500-pound bombs apiece, was devastating. And by mining the harbor, they couldn't get any supplies in. So they went to the bargaining table, but in the meantime, they had the Christmas offensive in December 1972, where we lost 16 B-52s were shot down by North Vietnamese, surface-to-air missiles. One of the examples of iron bombs is a major city south of Haiphong was called Thanh Hoa. They had a bridge, the Thanh Hoa Bridge. It was famous. For 3 years, it was tried to be dropped and knocked down. We lost 52 American aircraft over a 3-year period trying to drop that bridge. And they never did it until December 1972, when they came up with this new handheld thing called a laser-guided bomb that the Air Force had. The Air Force sent one guy dropped it and got the bridge. Those were the very, very early precision-guided weapons. Yep.
Use those?
Walleyes? Not really, because those are anti-personnel weapons. When rock eyes to destroy the SAM sites is what we wanted to do. That's what we use, which looks almost exactly the same, but the little bomblets are armor-piercing, and they'll destroy a missile site or a tank column or something like that, because the North Vietnamese came over into South Vietnam with tanks, over 400 armored vehicles. This just shows you everyone has to include this in a video about the Navy, is trying to land aboard an aircraft carrier at night. Notice I say trying. Too dramatic. That's our ship, CV-63. Big problem. In the Gulf of Tonkin, there are 3 or 4 aircraft carriers. You better land on the right one. True story. Hear the breathing? That's the pilot working his brains out, getting ready to land on an aircraft carrier at night. Not unusual. There's a carrier out there on that screen, you know. He's 3/4 of a mile. Where? What? Oh. When you hear the LSO say that power twice, you better apply power right now. That means you're sinking at the deck. The next thing he would say would be eject. I think we're about done. We are. So at the end of the whole evolution, the USS Kitty Hawk lost 12 aircraft, and we lost 6 crews. Let's stop this somehow. So any questions about anything? Sir?
In those kind of human conditions, what was the collective experience with the reliability of the AIM-7?
A real problem. Not only the humidity and the heat, but the fact that you have a very sophisticated radar-guided weapon banging on and off an aircraft carrier tends to loosen things up. The Navy had no, from a fighter standpoint, we had no confidence in using the Sparrow missile if we were going to engage a MiG. It would always be a Sidewinder. We had a lot of confidence in Sidewinders. Our air wing shot down 4 MiGs were all Sidewinders. The Navy never had a gun in their fighters. That you see your F-4 you have in front here, the Air Force F-4 has a gun. We would have killed for a gun. We would love that. We never had it. The Sidewinder was our weapon of choice.
Thank you.
Sir?
They didn't have gun pods?
No, not in the Navy. We also didn't have napalm. They took the napalm away, which is an anti-personnel weapon, which was fine, but it's so risky on aircraft carriers because of aircraft carrier fires. It was very useful on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but you could not use it up in North Vietnam.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Very useful.
Questions?
Yes.
Sir?
How do you navigate back to the ship?
Very carefully. You have an idea, and there's primitive, no such thing as GPS. Okay, you had TACAN, tactical air navigation, which they would not turn on because they're in something called ZipLip, which they don't want to do a lot of transmissions over the internet, over the net, while they're recovering aircraft. And so you better know where you're going. Get back to that story I said, you better land on the right carrier. If you don't, it's a free Liberty card for that ship to go to the aircraft, pull it off to the side on the ship, and paint it with spray cans any color as much as they want. So you do it now, the next day, because they delay, you can't take off right away. They'll keep you aboard that ship to harass the hell out of you for at least one night, and then send you back the next day looking like a Mardi Gras party favor. It is a big deal. Big deal.
Dennis, I understand that you flew Tomcats. How was the Tomcat's behavior at such a big plane compared to the Phantom?
It was a pleasure to bring aboard the ship because it could land about 15 to 20 knots slower. It had much better aerodynamics, much better electronics. It was a dream. It was just so much better. The only problem was it had absolutely terrible engines. And I've talked to a lot of you about it. They're very... in the F-4, I had 1 compressor stall, which means the airflow was disturbed and my engine had to be kind of shut down. In the F-14, with the same number of flight hours, I had over 1,000. I'm sorry, 100, excuse me, 100 compressor stalls. It was just a very poorly designed engine that they ultimately repaired and fixed for the follow-on models of the F-14. But the F-14, you have to realize, really never saw combat. It did see a little combat in Iraq, but it really never fired an air-to-air missile in anger. And they're no longer, they're all retired. Sir?
2 questions. One, did you see any benefit from Agent Orange? And second, did you read Thud Ridge?
What was the second question?
You read Thud Ridge?
Yes, I have read Thud Ridge, spectacular book. Matter of fact, the beginning of this tape, which I chose not to show because there's no pictures, there's a song there talking about the Red River Valley Rats, which is an Air Force organization which did some spectacular work up in North Vietnam. So again, the Navy was responsible for Haiphong, the Air Force was responsible for Hanoi. Air Force flew out of Thailand, and South Vietnam, we flew out of the Gulf of Tonkin. The Thud Ridge book is spectacular. Agent Orange, we're flying in 1972. You could see the demilitarized zone. They stopped dropping Agent Orange, I want to say late 1971. But the effect of it was clearly visible. Clearly visible.
You made several comments about you were actually looking forward to some MiGs.
Absolutely.
Coming at you.
That's what we're trained for.
May I ask why?
We want to shoot them down.
In other words, you knew you were superior.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, we with our briefings and our practice and our training, we knew that all the North Vietnamese pilots were Soviet trained. And we know Soviet training consists of massive ground control, basically people on the ground talking to the pilot in a fighter aircraft that's fully armed, put your stick forward, come to the right, increase your speed, decrease your speed. They're trying to fly the mission for them. It's just the way the Russians did their training. So we knew that. And they rarely engaged. When my squadron shot down its 2 MiGs, that was May 8th. That day, the Navy shot down 13 MiGs because they chose to come and engage us. They rarely would come to get us, rarely.
Were you ever in support of Wild Weasel
No,
missions?
no, that's the Air Force version. No, our equivalent, I can't remember the code word they used, but it was EA-6Bs. It was the A6, but with every frickin' pod in the world on it to jam everything. They were unbelievable because they'd go right into Indian country and do what they had to do. And to jam the weapons, especially the SAM sites. In hindsight, we probably were overly concerned and afraid of the SAM sites than we should have been. They, at least in the Kitty Hawk's experience, they were not terribly effective. They were much more effective in getting us down in altitude to be shot at by AAA. So I guess in essence, they accomplished their mission.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a terrific talk.